David's so-called empire is not a vast ancient Near Eastern empire. It's nothing like the empire of the Egyptians or the empire of the Assyrians from ancient Mesopotamia. David's nation in Israel itself is really very small, something like 100 miles long north to south, like 30 miles wide east to west. So it's a very small country.
Yet, it's an empire that David and the 12 tribes of Israel would pay any price to secure.
David, according to the stories in 2 Samuel, does conquer some of the surrounding peoples, the Moabites on the other side of the Dead Sea, the Edomites south of the Moabites, some of the city-states of Syria, ancient Aram, north of Moab. But there's no real indication that David exercises any kind of continuing control over these areas, over these provinces. These may well be simply one-time defeats.
There's little architectural evidence of any kind of imperial control over these areas because no towers or buildings remain. Although there's no record of exactly how David won the various battles he fought, David's military forces probably used the known weaponry and tactics of the day. In King David's day, opposing forces faced each other on the battlefield in long lines of battle. As they approached to the clash, various weapons were employed, and they were employed in series, usually depending on their range. The first to be employed would be bows and arrows. Archers would fire their arrows into the enemy formation. As things got closer, spears were next, long-edged weapons like this one, or longer, that would hopefully extend the individual soldier's reach beyond the reach of his enemy's weapon. Things get closer, it's time for swords. These were edged weapons usually made of bronze or iron with a thick fuller running the length of the blade to give it strength and slashing power. When things got really tight, daggers were employed. Now, you get this in the enemy's guts, or you die.
Unfortunately, we do not have a lot of information from the biblical text about David's battles, except from of his accomplishments and the territories that he added to the Israelite territory. There is one instance that it is mentioned, he split his army into two. He actually did a kind of a maneuver in order to deceive the enemy, to surprise him, to flank him.
David's expansionist activities were wide-ranging and frequent. It was during this warring period when the famous Bible story of David and Bathsheba takes place. That's a conquest of the bedroom, not the battlefield. But it is a turning point in David's military and political exploits.
David at this point controls an empire. And it is not really fitting for him to actually function as the commander-in-chief in the field. He has generals to do that. And even though he would like to go and do, he is counseled, stay in Jerusalem.
One steamy, sleepless night, David stepped out onto his palace balcony. As he looked to the city below, he spied a beautiful woman taking a bath on her rooftop.
We could speculate that she intended that the king see her bathing so as to capture his eye, and that's precisely what happened. And we see how David used the power that he had won for himself in battle and by political intrigue. He was now the king of all Israel, and if he beheld a woman that he desired, he simply summoned her. This is, again, what the Bible tells us.
And David sent and inquired after the woman.
He's told that she is the wife of a man named Uriah, a Hittite, presumably therefore not Israelite, but somebody who is a mercenary in David's army. And of course, according to the story, David, if he had made the right decision, would have or should have stopped there.
But David became a victim of his lust, so he pursued Bathsheba. By doing so, David betrayed not only her husband, but his own army.
This was a married woman, a woman whose husband was at that very moment fighting in the king's army, fighting for the cause of the king. And meanwhile, David was back in the palace, taking his pleasure with this good soldier's wife.
David slept with Bathsheba and made her pregnant. Their relationship became a scandal. But David tried to cover it up, even if it was a bit clumsily, by ordering Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba.
David summons Uriah to Jerusalem and says, "Tell me how the battle goes." And Uriah says, "The battle goes well." And now David says, "Go to your house and sleep with your wife." The next morning, David discovers that Uriah didn't go to his house.
And Uriah said, "Shall I go into my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife?"
He said, "How can I go to my house when the troops of Israel are out in the field, when these are my colleagues? I can't have these comforts." David tries to get him drunk and sends him home again, but Uriah doesn't go. Finally, David realizes that he has to get rid of Uriah.
He sent his faithful soldier to the front ranks of the battle against the Ammonites. He instructed his general, Joab, to pull back his men so that Uriah would be left defenseless. And conveniently enough, Uriah was killed.
These features of David's personality, his calculation, his cunning, but also his personal passion and sometimes his inability to control his personal passions, are very much on display in the biblical account of his life story.
With Uriah dead, Bathsheba entered the palace and became King David's favorite wife. That was the beginning of a personal and political crisis that eventually led to intrigue and civil war that put all of David's achievements in jeopardy. Now, here's King David's tips for conquerors. Symbols are important. Find one and use it. Cement alliances and employ your allies. Don't abuse your power. It can quickly backfire on you. As a king, a military leader, and a conqueror, King David relied on the loyalty of his troops. But when he sent Bathsheba's husband, a loyal soldier, on a calculated suicide mission, his men lost confidence in him, and that led to bloody insurrections. Now, those insurrections were painful to King David, both politically and personally. Why? Well, because most of the insurrections were led by his sons.
You read the story beginning at 2 Samuel 13 about David's dealings with his sons and with his family. And you see David's failings as a father. I think if you read those stories carefully, you see David still as the ruthless conqueror, only now he's not conquering, now he's maintaining his power. And he maintains it against his own sons.
David is a very complex figure. He's a father, not a particularly good one. He's a husband, not a particularly loyal one. He's a warrior, a very good one. In his culture, virtuous acts and humility were not behaviors that were particularly esteemed. So he can be ruthless. This is what one expects from a leader.
As David's power seemed to be waning, his sons sought to assert themselves, vying for the throne. And though David ultimately emerged victorious, it was not without bloodshed. 3 of his sons were killed. When it became clear that David was old and getting weaker, the intrigue intensified. And it was Bathsheba, David's favorite wife, who was most effective in her schemes.
Bathsheba slips into the king's bedchamber and makes a remarkable, articulate, compelling, also extremely romantic argument to the king as to why her son, Solomon, should be designated as the heir in favor of Adoniah, the main contender, another wife's son. And there's a very tender scene of David in his final audience with Bathsheba, and we see the stirring of that old passion that in a way had been his downfall.
Bathsheba used all of her feminine wiles and powers of persuasion to convince David to name Solomon as his heir. But there was one more twist. Ruthless in life, David did not intend to go quietly in death. He died the way he lived.
On his deathbed, David wanted to make sure that Solomon, his son, followed up and settled the scores that he had not yet settled during his lifetime.
He instructs Solomon in who the potential enemies are going to be after David's death. And like that famous scene at the end of The Godfather where all of the enemies of The Godfather are taken care of, that's exactly what happens at the beginning of the book of Kings. One by one, David's enemies, those who might threaten Solomon, those whom David promised, "I will not hurt you," are executed by Solomon. The young boy who then goes on to build a temple is a chip off of the old block.
Wherever David had put down rebellion or aggression, Solomon built fortresses and cities to maintain the kingdom. But together, their most spectacular achievement was neither militaristic nor civic. It was the construction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Though this temple was later to be destroyed by the Babylonians, and a second temple would be destroyed by the Romans, David had planted a flag that could not be forgotten.
David's legacy to the people of Israel today lies in the fact that he staked out this city as his own. It became the city of David, but not in the sense that it was his city. It was a city that belonged to no tribe, and therefore it belonged to all of the ancient Israelites. Even after the second temple was destroyed by the Romans, and the city lacked a temple, it maintains its status as the spiritual center of the Jewish people.
It also became a sacred place for Christians. It's the city where Jesus taught and died. And for Muslims, Jerusalem is where Muhammad found a pathway to the heavens.
The site of the temple, then, in human imagination and in human spiritual yearnings, becomes the spiritual center of almost all of Western civilization.
Like the city of Jerusalem itself, David was a paradox of violence and spirituality. History remembers him as a man of war, but it was his ideas and not his conquests that outlive him. His concept of a unified Israel has outlasted the millennia and has inspired modern Israel.
There's a remarkable moment in recent history where the military leadership of the modern state of Israel, on the eve of the Six-Day War in 1967, was considering the threat that the neighboring Arab countries, and especially Egypt, posed to the state of Israel. And there is recorded in history a statement made by one of the generals to the Prime Minister of Israel: "You have the greatest army in the Middle East since the time of David. You must use it." And on that argument, Israel decided to strike preemptively and won a mighty victory in the Six-Day War. That moment for me captures and defines the role of David in history.
Although it's been 3,000 years since his brief reign, King David's deeds continue to echo and reverberate. Military genius, a visionary, a man who grabbed every advantage, no matter how small, and turned it into victory. Maybe the world should remember King David, not so much for his skill with a sling, but for his ability to see beyond what was and realize what could be. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Thanks for watching, Conquerors.